All right, green growth. Let's get into it. So, about 20 years ago, when I started studying sustainable economics, I really understood that climate change was an issue. And to me, I realized most other people just had never heard of it, hadn't really thought about it, but it was getting bad. It was becoming more noticeable. And my assumption was that as it got worse, people would kind of wake up and realize, hey, climate change is happening. We should do something about it. And so, really, my question was, how bad does it have to get before people are going to wake up and take some kind of action? Well, over the last 20 years, it's gotten a lot worse. I think we're now at the point where it's undeniable. We're seeing climate impacts all over the world, all the time. Like it's here, it's happening. It's kind of undeniable at this point. The issue is that we do not have the public on our side in terms of any kind of climate action that is a sort of stick versus a carrot, right? When I think about economic policies, sticks are going to be things that are costly, like regulations or taxes. Carrots are the incentives, right? Are the subsidies. Right now, the public doesn't support any kind of climate stick. We had a consumer carbon tax here in Canada for a while. That is now gone. In the US, I think a carbon tax is a non-starter. Even this notion of an industrial carbon tax or any kind of price on pollution, which is how right-wing economists would like solve this problem, is we would put a price on carbon, and it's just, it ain't there. There's no public support for it. So this is just kind of the harsh reality is that, the more we've started to see climate impacts, it feels like the more resistance there is to any kind of climate action that is going to hurt people's pocketbook or even a corporate balance sheet in any way, shape, or form. So the result, as far as I'm concerned, is that we really only have one politically palatable path forward for climate action, which is green growth. That I think green growth, green jobs, green investment, green economic development, this is really the only thing that people can get behind right now. Making people's lives better, building green infrastructure that improves things for us, but also gives us that low carbon option. That's really, I think, the only path we have forward. So, I'm going to be talking about green growth today, kind of doing a bit of a lecture. This is a bit of a series for me. I want to start doing interviews. So make sure you subscribe, make sure you follow along. If you're interested in green growth, I'm going to bring a lot of really, really cool perspectives in the future. But for now, for today, I'm going to talk about the history of green growth. I'm going to ask this question, sort of what is green? Like, what are the definitions that we're using when it comes to green growth? Why do we need green growth? Why is growth a thing that we should be pursuing? Can have a little conversation about that. And then, I really love this idea of building a parallel green economy. So this is a sort of little thought that I've had, a seed that I want to plant, is this notion of building parallel economies. My name is Tim Nash. My company is Good Investing. I'm on a mission to help 1 million people invest intentionally. So if you want to take control of your own personal investments and avoid investing in companies that are part of the problem and invest in things and organizations and companies that are part of the solution, then, I'm your guy. Follow along. I've got some really great resource to help people invest intentionally. So when it comes to the history of green growth, this is something that I've been tracking for a while. It existed before I was born. I was born in 1982. In 1972, this book was published, Limits to Growth. And this was a sort of seminal work. This is the first time we started using computer models to be able to model out ecological limits. So, there are all kinds of ecological limits. We are in this sort of finite biosphere. There's this idea that we're on spaceship Earth, right? That the Earth has a certain amount of resources, just like a spaceship does. And we have to keep the levels at the right place. We can't kind of go off kilter. Otherwise, everything's going to die. So Limits to Growth was the first attempt to sort of look at what are these limits to economic growth. And in this case, they were primarily looking at ecological limits. One of my favorite quotes, just to kind of sum up this sort of philosophy, the worldview shift that Limits to Growth really was trying to bring into it is this quote from an economist, Kenneth Boulding. He says, anyone who believes that exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. So this is this notion of infinite growth on a finite planet. And this brings up a lot of different feelings and a lot of different thoughts and ideas, but this is the fundamental thing that we are starting to grasp with, or at least we started to grasp with, about 50 years ago, with this notion of infinite growth on a finite planet. Now, as an economist, I think it's possible. I think we can do it. I actually believe that we can grow infinitely on a finite planet, but the only way we can do it is through something called decoupling our economic growth from the environmental impacts. So in 2002, OECD came out with this report. This is, really looking at this concept of decoupling our economic activity from our environmental impact. From a climate change perspective, we really are looking at CO2 emissions. So for the longest time, the economy was growing and our CO2 emissions were growing, right? That those two things had a strong correlation. The more economic activity we had, the more CO2 emissions we had. The idea of decoupling is that can we grow the economy while actually seeing our CO2 emissions level off and actually, in a dream world, decline, so that these things are no longer heavily correlated. Now, I personally think this is possible. I think we can do it because I think when it comes to economic activity, we've seen this huge shift away from goods into services, right? And I think we've moved away from this notion of extraction as a means of economic growth. And when it comes to extraction, I mean resource extraction, but I also mean like what we call rent extraction, which is often exploiting social labor, right? Is part of that mentality as well, where we need to like extract things, the value, and that moving towards this notion of value creation. That when we create value, people are willing to pay for that. I think of something like art, where, what's the environmental impact of like a wonderful piece of art? And that the value that can create, that people are willing to pay to like experience that art, there's value there, no doubt. So there's economic activity, right? But it doesn't come with an environmental impact. So lots of room for creativity here, especially in a digital economy. Lots of room for this notion of economic activity, of value creation, this notion of services, right? In a way that is decoupled from our environmental impact and our CO2 emissions. So that's the idea. That's like the theory. That's how like economists, we justify, okay, we can still have growth. We can totally still have economic growth, but we're going to do it without the environmental impact. So in 2008, OECD kind of followed up with this in their first report towards green growth, right? This was really exciting at this time, where it was just like, okay, we can have this idea of green growth, right? There's a lot of conversations around this. How do we get that? How do we have that? 2008 is when the stock market crashed and we had the great financial crisis. So that kind of got thrown on the back burner. But this is also when I started my career. I graduated in 2008. And, this report was really influential for me in shaping my ideas of green growth and what that could be. So after I graduated, I got a volunteer position. I met with a mentor of mine, a woman named Hazel Henderson, who was all about this notion of green growth. She talked about the green economic transition. And we started asking this question, well, how are we doing with this? Are we seeing green growth, right? Are the dollars actually flowing? And so together we created something called the Green Transition Scoreboard. We launched it in, I think it was 2009. And we asked this question. We kind of created this goal of $10 trillion by 2020. That Hazel's, best guess was that if we had $10 trillion of investments flowing into green sectors by 2020, that would kickstart this unstoppable green transition, and we would be off to the races. And in that first year, we found over $1 trillion. And I counted every single year, we kept counting until 2019. We actually hit the goal. We hit $10 trillion of investments. Now, this is an aggregate, right? So I do add it up sort of every year. So, between 2008 and 2019, in that sort of decade period, we counted over $10 trillion flowing into things like renewable energy, energy efficiency, life systems, which was mostly water, green construction. And at that time I was counting corporate green R&D. Really cool going through and seeing, how much companies are investing in research and development. So we hit the mark. We high-fived, right? We were like, okay, we're doing it. The green economy is growing. We've hit that tipping point of more than $10 trillion, right? We thought it was a done deal. Obviously, the last kind of couple years, we're seeing a real shift away from green, these anti-green messaging. And so earlier this year, I kind of brought the research back and we updated the Green Transition Scoreboard. I worked with the team and we were able to find very much more consistent data than I was able to get before, going all the way back to 2015. Right. And so, what we could see is this data from 2015. And then again, this is an aggregate. So we added it up, all of these different numbers until we hit just a hair under $20 trillion. So in the last decade, I can say now that there's been about $20 trillion invested in green sectors. Which is renewable energy, buildings, transportation, water, and a new category that we added, which is green bonds. And so when a company raises bonds, that's a long-term investment. So we're going to count the money today, and then we kind of, assume that they're going to spend it over the next 4 years. So, really want to show that there is massive green growth right now, that this is something that we're tracking and that we're looking at. But it does beg the question of, what do we mean by green? And we had our definitions for that project. We actually omitted things like nuclear and carbon capture sequestration. But, we're not the sort of the one that gets to decide what's green or not. There are these governmental organizations that are working on it. The EU is furthest along. They've got what's called a taxonomy. So a taxonomy is like a set of definitions. They launched theirs in 2020. In 2022, they included natural gas as a transition fuel. Can't say I'm too thrilled about that. They also included nuclear, which, I'm a lot more open to, I would say, as a low carbon investment. So definitely the EU taxonomy, it's not perfect. I don't want to say this, but it's still very, very helpful. One of my mantras is don't let perfect be the enemy of good, right? So it's not perfect, but I still think it's really, really good that the EU has this taxonomy to define what they mean by green. Another taxonomy or another definition that I use is from a group called the Climate Bonds Initiative. They're really cool. They've been doing green bonds and certifying green bonds for a very long time. So in the absence of definitions, I tend to sort of default to theirs. They have standards for green bonds, for social bonds, and for sustainable bonds. And sustainable bonds are kind of like a mix of green and social. So they're super cool. They also differentiate between mitigation. Mitigation is things like renewable energy projects. So we're trying to reduce CO2 if we can replace fossil fuels, or energy efficiency would be mitigation. Again, we're trying to get carbon emissions down. So that's mitigation. Transition is going to be a little bit different. These are often going to be fossil fuel companies that are becoming more energy efficient. Sometimes it's fossil fuel companies. Sometimes it's an energy intensive industry like steel. So if we're trying to create low carbon steel, that would be considered more of a transition investment. And then they also have resilience bonds. Resilience bonds are so cool. This is like my favorite things. This is like wetlands conservation and restoration. This is about a water adaptation. So if we accept that, hey, the climate is changing and we need better water infrastructure and we need, let's say, nature preserves to be able to, protect us from flooding and other climate change impacts. That's going to fall under resilience, which is really, really cool. So Climate Bonds Initiative, their definitions are really my go-to. If we had to if I had to sort of pick one thing, I think it would be this. I'd be remiss if I didn't explain what was happening in Canada, my home country, that here in Canada, we have been talking about this for a long time. In 2018, there was the expert panel on sustainable finance that started talking about this. In 2021, it was the Sustainable Finance Action Council, that convened to have these discussions. And in 2022, we did establish a green bond framework, which is really cool, which again, I think is going to allow, this would be, if I had to guess what we're going to be doing in the next little while is probably seeing some action when it comes to green bonds. And because we do have a very strong framework there. But there is not an official Canadian taxonomy for this. There have been recommendations, but sort of nothing official. So TBD, hopefully we'll get something soon, fingers crossed. The biggest questions when it comes to what is green. So these are the sticky wickets, so to speak. CCUS, which is carbon capture and sequestration. So this is going to be, a big issue. This is the idea of fossil fuel extraction. So in Canada, we have the oil sands or the tar sands in Alberta, and that they extract oil from Alberta. And that what we're able to do is capture the CO2 emissions, not from the oil that we're pulling out, that's still going to get shipped out and refined and burned, but the amount of energy it takes to extract all of those fossil fuels is really intense. And so if we can capture that carbon, so we're still producing fossil fuels, but we're using less fossil fuels to capture fossil fuels, I know, but this is a big conversation that we're going to be having in Canada. And it's a big question mark. Does that count as green or not? Natural gas is like a bridge fuel. Most of that has been debunked, that it's not really a bridge fuel. There are also a lot of concerns around methane with natural gas, but that is still in some places, they say, hey, natural gas, if we can use that to displace coal, that it's like a transition fuel. And then nuclear. I think that's going to get the thumbs up. To me, it's I'm not really concerned about nuclear from an environmental perspective, especially with some of the newer small modular reactors that are coming online. For me, it is more about the economics of it that I have concerns with. Also this question, room for resilience, it's so rare that I see a conservation bond. There was a really cool conservation impact bond near my hometown of London, Ontario by the Carolinian Institute. Love seeing this conservation impact bond, but I'm not seeing this in a lot of taxonomies. I'm not seeing it in any of the bigger conversations. So, really curious to see, is there room for resilience in our definitions of green? And, to me, I think, will Canada issue another green bond? And it wouldn't shock me to see a big number, $10 billion, $100 billion. If we're going to be building a lot of green infrastructure here in Canada, right, then I think it makes perfect sense for us to use that green bond framework. I think it'd be a great way to sort of signal this notion of green growth. So fingers crossed, that's, will we get a green bond? My hope is yes. So why do we need growth? What's the deal with growth? Tim, why do we even need to grow? Capitalism is busted. Are you sure we need growth? Well, yeah, I kind of am. It's been really interesting, the conversations in ecological services, or ecological circles rather. We used to see this was kind of a big book, The Future of Degrowth, A Guide to a World Beyond Capitalism, right? I think a lot of us, recognize these limits to growth, and we're like, okay, capitalism is the problem. We need a system other than capitalism. Can we have degrowth kind of thing? That said, I really don't think there's any appetite for that. I don't. I'm of the case that, the way I think the conversation is moving is towards this notion of abundance, that if we can have excess, if we can have so much solar power, more than what we need, prices are low. If we can, produce sustainable food in a way such that we have abundance, that prices stay low, really this notion of choices and a good quality of life, and having sort of that a green growth. I just think it's much more appealing, especially to a broader audience. There's a little bit of a middle path. I've heard some people talk about sloth, which is slow growth. I don't know. I think that's a really hard thing to get. But to me, it's like I do see this story of abundance as being much more, again, politically palatable. I'm not here to say which one we should do, which one would be better long term, things like that. We can have a debate there, but recognizing the anti-green movement being what it is right now, my feeling is that we should be leaning much more towards this abundance narrative. Because the fact is, we live in a debt-based economy. And I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here, but there is this whole field around fractional reserve banking. And I've had some interesting conversations around this notion of fiat currency. It's really interesting to me with Bitcoin and crypto. A lot of people have been exploring how money gets created and these different mechanisms. A lot of people see Bitcoin and digital currencies as a way to be able to sort of move beyond that or protect themselves from this sort of unsustainable debt-based economy. But the fact is, however you want to cut it, we are in a debt-based economy. Debt accounts for about 98% of our money supply. This is how we create money in our economy, is via debt. So when we accept that debt is the thing that grows the economy, then we also have to accept that we need to pay interest on our debt. That if we're borrowing in order to grow, whatever is growing needs to grow fast enough to be able to pay interest on that debt. And hopefully earn a little return on investment as well. But first and foremost, we need to pay interest on our debt, which means that this notion of degrowth, if we ever started degrowing and the economy wasn't growing, then we would start to see defaults on our debt, right? There's just not enough money to pay the debt back plus the interest. We would have defaults. And that's where the house of cards really starts to fall, is that, this is the most precarious part of our economic system right now, is that we are an economy based on debt. And if people start to default, and really that economy, when it turns, can turn very quickly. And, I'm telling you, even though, I have some environmentalists or ecologists would say, hey, that's how we restore balance. I don't want to have to tell you how bad that would get from a human empathy standpoint. If that's the way we're going to restore balance, that's very, very, very sad to me. That an economic collapse is, just as bad as an ecological collapse. In fact, those two things are very much, could go hand in hand with each other. I don't want that. I don't want that. So that's why we need to keep growing. We need an economy that grows in order to create jobs. And, another part of this is understanding that social impact. We've already started to see the impacts of a bad economy. That is, capitalism fails. Right? We start to see higher unemployment. We start to see wider income inequality, wider wealth inequality. Those cracks in our society are showing, right? And that's another problem. That's another issue. And as the economy deteriorates, if that were to happen, right, then we're in a situation where the house of cards is falling apart. People aren't going to care about ecological limits anymore. And I think it does start to push us towards leaders with very simple, easy solutions and scapegoats. So the rise of fascism, in my mind, is part and parcel with a deteriorating economy. So to me, this is really a scary thought, but this is why I think we need growth, because if we don't have growth, right, if we don't look after our economy, we don't look after our people, then, I don't think people are going to care about looking after our planet. So it really is important that we do look after our economy. And if we have this notion of abundance, and if we have this notion of sort of looking after each other and a sustainable economy, I just think that's going to be so much better than like burning the whole thing down. Which is why, to me now it's like, what do we do? How do we approach this? Where do we go from here? Tim, like the economy is broken, what do we do? Well, to me, it's this notion of a parallel economy. The analogy that I use is sort of that capitalism is busted right now. And so it's going to be understanding, how do we, rather than trying to fix it, How do we build a parallel economy? Because the fact is right now, there's no appetite to change our current economy. There just isn't. This is some numbers from a survey for major projects. So here in Canada, we're looking at a whole bunch of different projects, everything from hydroelectricity projects, which have very high approval ratings in the sort of, 85 to 90% support for new hydroelectricity projects. At the bottom, we've got carbon capture and sequestration facilities. These have about sort of 55 to 60% support. It does vary by province across Canada, right? But it's understanding that, hey, when it comes to something like pipelines, we can see that across the board, 70% of Canadians support new or expanded oil pipelines right now. This is a public opinion poll. This was done by the Privy Council office. So the government did polling, polled Canadians, and 70% of Canadians support pipelines right now, right? So it's just the type of thing where, understanding that there is public support for major projects, and some of them are things that I don't want, right? Things like highways, 80 to 90% support for highways, right? Really, really high support for building more highways. More support for building highways than there is for high-speed rails, which is, anywhere from the lowest is 60% in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, up to about 74% in BC, right? So it's the type of thing where I don't think we can say as environmentalists, no new pipelines anymore. I don't think we can. I think if we're obstructionist, if we get in the way of these things and make it harder to be able to build some of the fossil fuel infrastructure, I think people are really going to be after us. I don't think if we're on a train and the tracks are headed off the cliff, I don't think our political system will let us change the rails or shift the economy or transition, anything like that. I think that especially with the anti-green sentiment, it's just going to create, if we're obstructionist, it's going to create more friction, which we don't need. So instead, what I want to do is build a parallel track. So if we're going to build more highways, let's build some high-speed railways alongside of it. If we're going to build new pipelines, let's build long-distance electrical transmission lines so that we can build these huge hydro projects and wind projects, right, on the East Coast and in Quebec, and we can have that electricity ship across Canada alongside the pipelines. So really, for me, this is kind of the language that I'm starting to use, is to try to be less obstructionist and more focus on this notion of a parallel economy. So let's build transmission lines alongside pipelines, right? Let's build high-speed rail alongside highways. We're very lucky in that we have a credit union system right now alongside the big banks. If you don't want to have the banks, there's a parallel track where you can, do your savings and your banking with a credit union instead. I would love to see more of those options, right? So that we can continue to grow the economy and just build something that's better right alongside the old infrastructure. So that now all of a sudden people have a choice. We're not saying you can't drive, but we're saying, hey, why the heck would you drive when you can take a high-speed train? Let's create those better solutions. Part of all of this that I think is going to be absolutely critical, because so much of this is going through rural areas. And I think we have a major problem right now in Canada between rural and urban divide. And then as well, this notion of Indigenous rights is paramount to getting new projects built in Canada. So to me, what I want to see part of this parallel economy is that it can't just be shareholders that benefit from this. We need local and Indigenous ownership of projects. This is how we're going to get buy-in from rural communities, from Indigenous communities. Let's invite them to be a part of this. Let's create financing, right? So that people can access financing to be able to have large equity stakes in the projects that are going through their backyards. To me, that's an absolute no-brainer. And so as we're building this parallel green economy, we need to do it alongside local and indigenous people who are being affected by these projects. I think it's absolutely critical. So, just kind of wrapping up, for me, this is more of a philosophic thing. I really want to stop opposing projects. I want to start proposing projects. I even want to be investing in those projects. Let's get local financing so that people can, benefit from the green projects that are being built in their backyards and their communities. Let's get people involved. It's a great engagement tool to be able to get support for these things. So, that's really what I'm going to be focused on for the next little while. Is proposing cool parallel economy projects, and then encouraging investment products, and for people to, with their own personal money, be able to invest in these things that are going to make their lives better. Really, my mission is to help us put our money where our values are. That's what I want to do first and foremost. That's my entire sort of mission for good investing, is helping people invest their own personal money into things that they believe in, at least at a minimum, sort of do less evil, and let's avoid the things that run contrary to our values. But more and more, I'm realizing the need to really have people invest in things that they do believe in, that they do feel good about. Let's use our investment dollars to create the world that we want to retire into, that we want our kids to grow up in, right? Let's build that economy for them to be able to graduate into the world and have a good job doing something that they can feel good about and that is very much values aligned. So that's it. If you enjoyed this, make sure you subscribe, because I'm coming out with a whole bunch of interviews with really, really smart people on this topic. If you've got questions, comments, thoughts, ideas, I want to hear them. So you can put them in the comments. You can always email me, tim@goodinvesting.com. I love hearing from folks. But those are my thoughts on green growth, and I look forward to exploring this topic more.